The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop outside the dusty Kansas settlement, and Dorothy Evans pressed her gloved hand against the window, wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life. The town of Salina stretched before her in the afternoon heat of August 1878, a collection of weathered buildings that looked far more desperate than the modest descriptions in the letters had suggested. She stepped down onto the dirt street with her worn carpetbag clutched tight, her dark blue traveling dress already clinging to her skin despite the relatively mild temperature. At 22 years old, she had traveled from Philadelphia with nothing but hope and a promise from a man she had never met, a cowboy named Grant Mallory who needed a wife and had placed an advertisement that seemed almost too practical to be dangerous. The other passengers dispersed quickly, leaving Dorothy standing alone beside the stage office, scanning the faces of the few men who lingered nearby. None of them approached her, and for a terrible moment she wondered if Grant had changed his mind, if he had found someone else or decided that a mail-order bride was a foolish investment after all. Back in Philadelphia, she had worked 16-hour days in a textile mill, her fingers raw and bleeding from the machines, her lungs thick with cotton dust. When her mother died of consumption and her landlord demanded payment she could not give, the advertisement had seemed like Providence itself. A cowboy seeking a hard-working woman, no beauty required, honest work and fair treatment guaranteed. She had expected hardship, expected a rough man with rougher ways, expected to earn her keep through backbreaking labor and silent endurance. A tall figure emerged from the general store across the street, and Dorothy felt her breath catch as he moved toward her with long, unhurried strides. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 28 or 29, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that curled slightly beneath his wide-brimmed hat. His face was angular and weathered, but his eyes were a startling shade of gray-blue that seemed almost gentle as they found hers. He stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat, revealing more of that wavy hair, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed. "Miss Evans." His voice was low and careful, with a slight drawl that spoke of years under the Kansas sky. "I am Grant Mallory." Dorothy nodded, unable to find her voice for a moment. She had expected someone harder, someone who would look at her with the cold assessment she had grown used to in the mill, where women were valued only for what their hands could produce. Instead, Grant's gaze held something like nervousness, and he twisted his hat between his hands as though he were the one who had traveled across half the country to meet a stranger. "I am Dorothy," she managed, and then felt foolish for stating the obvious. "Thank you for meeting me." "Of course." He glanced at her carpetbag, and she saw him hesitate before reaching for it. "May I carry that for you? My wagon is just down the street. I thought we could stop by the boarding house first, if you would like. Mrs. Patterson has a room ready for you." "I did not want you to feel pressured to come straight to the ranch." Dorothy stared at him, confusion replacing some of her anxiety. "A room at the boarding house." Grant's expression became uncertain, and a faint flush colored his tanned cheeks. "I thought you might want some time to get acquainted before we make any permanent arrangements. The boarding house is respectable, and Mrs. Patterson is a kind woman. You can stay there while we get to know each other, and if you decide this is not what you want, I will pay for your passage back to Philadelphia." The offer was so unexpected that Dorothy felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly. No one in her life had ever given her a choice before, had ever suggested that her comfort or wishes might matter. She had sold most of her possessions to afford the train fare west, had burned every bridge in Philadelphia to come here, and she had been prepared to marry this stranger immediately if required. The idea that he would give her time, that he would let her leave if she wished, was almost incomprehensible. "That is very kind," she said quietly. "But I should tell you that I have no money for a return ticket. I used everything I had to come here." Grant nodded slowly, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "That does not matter. If you are unhappy, I will not trap you here. I need a wife, Miss Evans, but I do not need a prisoner. I want someone who chooses to stay." They walked together down the dusty main street of Salina, past the saloon where a tinny piano played, past the smithy where the clang of hammer on metal rang out in steady rhythm. Grant carried her bag easily, and he pointed out the various establishments as they passed. The doctor's office, the church with its simple white steeple, the land office where he said the town was slowly filling with homesteaders and farmers. Salina was still rough around the edges, but it was growing, becoming something more than just a collection of desperate souls scratching at the Kansas soil. The boarding house was a two-story structure painted a faded yellow, with a wide porch where two elderly women sat shelling peas. They looked up with open curiosity as Grant and Dorothy approached, and one of them called out a greeting that Grant returned warmly. Inside, the house smelled of baking bread and lavender, and a plump woman with graying hair came bustling out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Miss Evans," she said with a warm smile. "I am Clara Patterson. Grant has told me all about you. Well, not all about you, since I suppose he does not know much yet, but he has been very concerned that everything should be comfortable for you." Dorothy thanked her and followed Mrs. Patterson up the narrow stairs to a small room at the back of the house. It was simply furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window, but it was clean and quiet, and the window looked out over a small garden where tomatoes grew in neat rows. After the cramped tenement she had shared with 3 other mill girls, it seemed almost luxurious. Grant waited downstairs, and when Dorothy returned, she found him talking quietly with Mrs. Patterson in the front parlor. He straightened when he saw her, and that uncertain expression crossed his face again. "Would you like to see the ranch?" he asked. "It is about 4 miles from town. I understand if you are too tired from traveling, but I thought you might want to know what you are considering." Dorothy agreed, and they walked to where Grant had left his wagon hitched outside the general store. He helped her up onto the seat with a gentle hand under her elbow, and she noticed that his palms were calloused, but his touch was careful. As they rolled out of town, the landscape opened up into rolling prairie dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. The sky seemed impossibly vast after the narrow streets of Philadelphia, and the air smelled of grass and sun-warmed earth. Grant talked as he drove, his voice growing more relaxed as he pointed out landmarks and explained the workings of his ranch. He ran cattle on 300 acres, a modest operation that he had built up slowly over the past 6 years. He had a small herd of about 200 head, and he employed 2 hands who helped with the roundups and branding. His house was simple, he warned, just 4 rooms that he had built himself with help from neighbors. He had a vegetable garden that was doing poorly because he did not have much skill with growing things, and a small barn for the horses and a milk cow. "I am not a rich man," he said, glancing at her with something like apology in his eyes. "I can provide a decent living, but it will never be fancy. I thought I should be honest about that in my letters, but sometimes words on paper do not convey the full reality." "I did not come here expecting luxury," Dorothy said. "I came here expecting hard work and a roof over my head. Anything beyond that is more than I hoped for." Grant's hands tightened on the reins, and he was quiet for a moment. "What kind of life did you have in Philadelphia?" Dorothy hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. but something about the open landscape and Grant's quiet presence made her want to be honest. I worked in a textile mill from the time I was 14. My father died when I was young, and my mother and I needed the money. She died 6 months ago, and I found I could not keep up with rent on my wages alone. The mill owners care nothing for their workers. We were just hands to feed the machines. That sounds like a hard life, Grant said quietly. It was the only life I knew. Dorothy looked down at her hands, at the faint scars that marked years of cuts and scrapes from the machinery. When I saw your advertisement, I thought that at least in Kansas I might have some fresh air and space to breathe. I did not dare hope for more than that. The ranch came into view as they crested a low hill, and Dorothy saw a house that was indeed simple but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that faced east. The barn was well maintained, and there was a corral where several horses stood dozing in the afternoon sun. 2 dogs came running to greet the wagon, tails wagging furiously, and Grant called to them affectionately. As he helped Dorothy down, she saw the care he had taken with the place. The woodwork was neat, the windows fitted properly, and there were even flower boxes beneath the front windows, though the flowers inside them were struggling. I tried to plant petunias, Grant admitted, following her gaze. But I think I water them too much, or not enough. I am never quite sure. Dorothy smiled at that, her first genuine smile since arriving in Kansas. I do not know much about flowers, but I can learn. I am good at following instructions. Grant showed her through the house, and she could see that he had made an effort to prepare for her arrival. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace and a sturdy table he had clearly built himself. There were 2 bedrooms, one that Grant used and one that he said he had prepared for her if she decided to stay. The room held a bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser, and a washstand, and there was a hook on the back of the door for hanging clothes. It was simple and clean, and through the window she could see the prairie stretching away toward the horizon. I know it is not much, Grant said from the doorway, but I wanted you to have your own space. If we marry, we can decide together how we want to arrange things. I do not expect anything from you that you are not ready to give. Dorothy turned to face him, and she saw that he was completely serious. This man, this stranger who had sent for a bride through the mail, was offering her a choice in time and respect. It was so different from what she had expected that she felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of fear and resignation that had lived there for years. "Why did you place the advertisement?" she asked. "A man like you could surely find a wife here in Kansas without sending all the way to Philadelphia." Grant leaned against the doorframe, and his expression turned thoughtful. "There are not many unmarried women in Salina, and those who are here have their pick of suitors. I am not good with smooth words or courting rituals. I am better with horses and cattle than I am with people. I thought that if I could find someone practical, someone who understood that life here is about work and partnership rather than romance, we might build something honest together." "You do not believe in romance?" Dorothy asked, curious. "I believe in respect and kindness," Grant said. "I believe in 2 people working together toward a common goal. Romance is fine for novels, but out here, I think what matters more is whether 2 people can trust each other and build a life together. I want a partner, Miss Evans. Someone to share this place with, to make decisions with, to face the hard times with. If affection grows from that, then that would be a blessing. But I do not expect you to pretend feelings you do not have." They walked back outside, and Grant introduced her to the 2 ranch hands, a weathered older man named Tom Wyatt and a young Mexican fellow named Carlos Mendez. Both men greeted her politely, and she could see the curiosity in their eyes. though they were too well-mannered to ask questions. Grant showed her the garden, which was indeed struggling, with bean plants that looked wilted and tomatoes that were not ripening properly. She knelt down to examine the soil and found it dry and compacted. "This needs more water and the soil needs to be loosened," she said. "And these tomatoes need to have the lower leaves trimmed so the fruit can get more sun." In the mill, some of the women grew vegetables in window boxes, and they taught me a few things. Grant crouched beside her, watching as she gently touched the tomato plants. "I would be grateful for any help. I can manage the cattle and the horses, but I have never been able to make much grow except grass." They spent the next hour in the garden, and Dorothy found herself relaxing as she worked the soil and explained what she knew about growing vegetables. Grant listened attentively and asked questions, and she realized that he genuinely valued her knowledge, even about something as simple as tomato plants. When the sun began to dip lower in the sky, he suggested they head back to town so she could have dinner at the boarding house and rest from her journey. On the ride back, Dorothy felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt seen. Not as a pair of hands to work a machine, not as a burden or an obligation, but as a person with knowledge and value. Grant asked her about Philadelphia, about what she liked to do when she was not working, about whether she had family elsewhere. She told him about her love of reading, about how she used to borrow books from a lending library and read them by candlelight after her shifts at the mill. She told him about her mother, who had been gentle and kind despite their poverty, and who had taught her to always look for the good in people. In turn, Grant told her about his own family. His parents had died of fever when he was 17, and he had an older brother who had gone to California to seek his fortune in the gold fields and had never returned. He had worked as a ranch hand for several years before saving enough to buy this land, and he had built his life here slowly and carefully, never taking risks he could not afford. He spoke of his hopes to expand his herd, to maybe build a bigger house someday, to be part of the growing community in Salina. By the time they reached the boarding house, the sun was setting in shades of orange and pink that painted the prairie sky like fire. Grant helped Dorothy down from the wagon, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Will you have dinner with me tomorrow?" he asked. "There is a restaurant in town, nothing fancy, but the food is decent. I would like to continue getting to know you, if you are willing." Dorothy agreed, and as she watched him drive away, she felt a flutter of something in her chest that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of something else entirely. The next 2 weeks passed in a gentle rhythm that Dorothy had never experienced before. Grant came to town every day, and they spent hours together, talking and walking and learning about each other. He took her fishing at a creek that ran through his property, and he laughed when she squealed at the wiggling fish she caught. He showed her how to ride one of his gentler horses, and he was patient when she was nervous, standing close to steady her until she found her confidence. They worked together in the garden, and she taught him how to properly water and tend the plants, and he taught her the names of the wildflowers that grew across the prairie. Mrs. Patterson observed all of this with approval, and she told Dorothy one evening that Grant Mallory was one of the finest young men in Salina, honest and hardworking and kind. The other women at the boarding house agreed, and they shared stories of times when Grant had helped neighbors without asking for payment, when he had given cattle to families who were struggling, when he had worked alongside others to build a new schoolhouse for the town. Dorothy found herself looking forward to each day with an eagerness that surprised her. Grant was unlike any man she had known in Philadelphia. He never raised his voice, never looked at her with anything but respect, never made her feel that she owed him something for his time or attention. He asked her opinions on matters ranging from which breed of cattle was best suited to Kansas, to what she thought about the books he borrowed for her from a neighbor's small collection. He remembered things she said in passing, and he surprised her with small gifts: a length of blue ribbon that matched her eyes, a jar of honey from a local beekeeper, a smooth stone from the creek that was veined with white quartz. One evening, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Grant turned to her with a serious expression. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." She felt her heart skip, unsure what he might ask. "Of course." "Are you happy here? I know this is very different from what you knew in Philadelphia, and I know the town is rough and the life is hard. If you are not happy, if you want to return east, I will understand. But if you think you could be content here, if you think we could build something together, then I would like to ask you to marry me." Dorothy looked at him, at this man who had shown her more tenderness in 2 weeks than she had known in her entire life. She thought about the mill, about the gray skies and the gray buildings and the gray exhaustion that had defined her existence there. She thought about the prairie sky and the space to breathe and the way Grant looked at her as though she mattered. "I am happy here," she said softly. "Happier than I have ever been. I would be honored to marry you, Grant." His face broke into a smile that transformed him, and he reached out to take her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret this decision," he said. "I promise you that." They were married 3 days later in the simple white church, with Mrs. Patterson and the 2 ranch hands as witnesses. Dorothy wore a dress that Mrs. Patterson and the other boarding house ladies had helped her make from fabric Grant had purchased at the general store, a soft cotton in pale green that brought out the color of her eyes. Grant wore his best suit, which was a bit worn but clean and pressed, and he looked at her as they exchanged vows with an expression of wonder that made her breath catch. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony, speaking about partnership and commitment and the building of a life together. When Grant kissed her, it was brief and gentle, and Dorothy felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the August heat. They had a small celebration at the boarding house, with cake that Mrs. Patterson had baked and lemonade and well wishes from the dozen or so townspeople who had come to witness the wedding. Then Grant helped Dorothy into the wagon, her few possessions loaded in the back, and they rode out to the ranch as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie. Dorothy was nervous as they approached the house, unsure what Grant would expect of her now that they were married. But he seemed to sense her anxiety, and when they arrived, he carried her things into the bedroom he had prepared for her and set them down gently. "This is still your room," he said quietly. "Nothing has to change until you are ready. I meant what I said about not expecting anything from you. We are partners now, Dorothy, and partners need to trust each other. I do not want you to feel afraid or obligated." Dorothy felt tears sting her eyes, and she blinked them back as she looked at this man who was now her husband. "I do not know how to be a wife," she admitted. "I do not know what you need or what I should do." Grant smiled and reached out to gently touch her cheek, his rough fingers surprisingly tender. "I do not know how to be a husband either. I think we will figure it out together. For now, I just want you to feel at home here. This is your place as much as it is mine." They settled into a routine over the following weeks, and Dorothy discovered that life on the ranch was indeed hard work, but it was work that felt meaningful in a way the mill never had. She rose before dawn to help Grant with the morning chores, feeding the chickens he had acquired for her, collecting eggs, helping milk the cow. She learned to make bread and cook simple meals over the fireplace, and Grant praised everything she made even when she knew it was not quite right. She tended the garden, and under her care, it began to flourish, providing fresh vegetables that made their meals feel abundant even when they were simple. Grant was patient and kind in all things, teaching her about the ranch and the animals, showing her how to read weather patterns in the sky, explaining the rhythms of the seasons and the cattle business. He consulted her on decisions, asking her opinion about whether to buy a new bull or wait another season, whether to plant wheat in the back 40 acres or keep it for grazing. Dorothy began to feel that she truly was his partner, that her thoughts and contributions mattered. At night, they sat together on the porch, and Grant told her stories about the early days in Salina, about the hardships and the triumphs of the settlers who had come to Kansas to build new lives. Dorothy shared her own stories, and she found herself able to talk about the painful parts of her past without feeling crushed by them. Grant listened without judgment, and his presence was a comfort that slowly began to heal old wounds. 6 weeks after their wedding, Dorothy woke in the middle of the night to the sound of thunder. She rose and went to the window, watching lightning flash across the prairie, illuminating the rolling grassland in stark white bursts. Rain began to pour down, heavy and fierce, and she heard Grant moving in his room. He appeared in her doorway, dressed hastily, his hair disheveled. "I need to check on the horses," he said. "Sometimes they spook in storms like this. Stay inside where it is safe." But Dorothy followed him out into the rain, unwilling to let him face the storm alone. They ran together to the barn, and inside they found the horses restless and nervous, stamping and tossing their heads. Grant moved among them with calm confidence, speaking in low, soothing tones, and Dorothy helped as best she could, stroking velvet noses and offering reassurance. When the storm finally passed and they returned to the house, they were both soaked through, water dripping from their clothes and hair. Grant built up the fire while Dorothy changed into dry clothes, and when she emerged from her room, he had set a kettle to boil for tea. They sat together by the fire, wrapped in blankets, warming their hands on the tin cups. "Thank you for coming out with me," Grant said. "You did not have to do that." "I wanted to," Dorothy said. "I am your wife, Grant, your partner. I want to be there for you through storms and everything else." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. He set down his cup and reached out to take her hand, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Dorothy, I need to tell you something. I thought when I sent for a mail-order bride that I would be getting a practical arrangement, a partnership based on mutual need. But what I have found with you is so much more than that. You are kind and brave and smart, and you make this house feel like a home. I know we agreed that this marriage would be about partnership rather than romance, but I find that my feelings for you have grown into something deeper. I am falling in love with you, and I needed you to know." Dorothy's heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. She had been afraid to acknowledge her own growing feelings, afraid that she was reading too much into his kindness, afraid of being hurt. But hearing him speak so honestly gave her the courage to be honest in return. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I did not know it was possible to feel this way. I did not know that someone could be so gentle and good." Grant pulled her into his arms then, and she went willingly, feeling the strength of him and the warmth and the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. He held her as though she were precious, as though she were something to be treasured, and Dorothy felt something deep within her unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in blankets by the fire, holding each other and speaking in quiet voices about their hopes and dreams. When Grant finally kissed her, it was different from the brief kiss at their wedding. This kiss was slow and deep and full of promise, and Dorothy felt herself responding with a passion she had not known she possessed. She had expected hardship from this marriage, had expected to endure whatever was required of her, but instead she had found tenderness and love and a partner who saw her as an equal. That night, Dorothy did not return to her own room. She stayed with Grant, and they learned each other with gentle hands and patient exploration, building a physical intimacy that matched the emotional bond they had been forming. Grant was careful and considerate, constantly checking that she was comfortable, that she wanted to continue, and his tenderness brought tears to her eyes even as it brought her joy. In the months that followed, their love deepened and strengthened. They worked side by side through the long days, building their ranch and their life together. Dorothy proved to have a talent for animal husbandry, and she convinced Grant to buy a small flock of sheep that she cared for with dedication. The wool she sheared from them in the spring brought in extra money, and she learned to spin it into yarn that she sold in town. Grant's cattle herd grew steadily, and with Dorothy's help in managing the finances and planning for the future, the ranch became more profitable than it had ever been. Salina was growing too, transforming from a rough frontier town into a proper community. A new school was built, and a second church, and more businesses opened along the main street. Grant and Dorothy became well-respected members of the community, known for their hard work and their willingness to help neighbors in need. They hosted barn dances and helped organize social events, and their home became a place where people felt welcome. Winter came, bringing snow and cold winds that howled across the prairie. Dorothy had never experienced cold like this, and Grant made sure she had warm clothes and plenty of wood for the fire. They spent the long winter evenings together, and Dorothy read aloud from books while Grant worked on repairing tack or carving small wooden figures that he sold in town. Sometimes they just talked, sharing their thoughts and dreams and making plans for the spring. It was during that first winter that Dorothy discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not been certain until Mrs. Patterson, who had some experience with such matters, confirmed it during a visit to town. Dorothy was both excited and terrified, unsure if she would be a good mother, unsure if she could handle the responsibility. But when she told Grant that evening, his face lit up with such joy that her fears diminished. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly, pulling her into his arms. "Dorothy, this is the best news. You are going to be a wonderful mother." "How do you know that?" she asked, still uncertain. "Because you are kind and patient and loving," he said. "Because you care for every living thing on this ranch with tenderness. Because you have shown me what it means to truly care for another person." Grant became even more protective and attentive as Dorothy's pregnancy progressed. He insisted she not overwork herself, taking on extra chores so she could rest. He brought her tea and made her comfortable and rubbed her aching back when the baby made her uncomfortable. He talked to her belly, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and promising to teach them how to ride and rope and care for the land. Spring arrived in a burst of green and wildflowers, and Dorothy worked in the garden despite Grant's protests, insisting that she needed to stay active. The vegetables she planted grew bountifully under her care, and she put up preserves and canned goods for the coming winter. The ranch was thriving, with new calves born and the sheep producing fine wool, and Dorothy felt a deep satisfaction in what they had built together. In early June of 1879, on a warm evening when the prairie was bathed in golden light, Dorothy went into labor. Grant rode hard for the doctor and Mrs. Patterson, and they arrived at the ranch as the sun was setting. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Dorothy was afraid, but Grant stayed with her throughout, holding her hand and speaking encouragement even when she could not respond. Their son was born just after midnight, a healthy baby with a strong cry and his father's gray-blue eyes. Grant held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and when he looked at Dorothy, she saw such love and gratitude in his expression that it took her breath away. "What should we name him?" Grant asked softly. Dorothy had been thinking about this for months. "What was your father's name, James?" Grant said. "James Mallory." "Then let us call him James," Dorothy said, "after a good man and in hopes that our son will be just as good." They called him James, and he became the center of their world. Grant proved to be a devoted father, patient and playful, rising in the night to walk the floor with the baby when he was fussy so Dorothy could rest. Dorothy discovered that her fears about motherhood were unfounded. She took to caring for James with the same tenderness she brought to everything else, and watching Grant with their son made her fall even more deeply in love with him. The seasons turned and James grew, from a tiny infant to a chubby baby who laughed at everything to a curious toddler who followed his father everywhere. The ranch continued to prosper, and Grant was able to hire another hand and buy more land. Dorothy's sheep flock expanded, and she became known throughout the region for the quality of her wool. They built an addition onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper parlor, making room for their growing family. When James was 2 years old, Dorothy gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after Dorothy's mother. She had Grant's wavy hair but Dorothy's green eyes, and she was quieter than her brother, content to watch the world with solemn observation. Grant doted on her, calling her his prairie flower, and Dorothy often found him sitting with Margaret in his arms, singing soft cowboy ballads that made the baby smile. Life was not without challenges. There were droughts that tested their resolve, and hard winters when they worried about the cattle and the sheep. There were illnesses that swept through Salina, and times when they lost animals to predators or accidents. But through everything, Grant and Dorothy faced the difficulties together, supporting each other and finding strength in their partnership. One evening, when James was 5 and Margaret was 3, Dorothy stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Grant came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice rumbling in her ear. "I am thinking about how different my life is from what I imagined," Dorothy said. "When I stepped off that stagecoach in Salina, I was so afraid. I expected hardship and difficulty and a lifetime of just surviving. Instead, I found you. I found love and happiness and a home. I found everything I never dared to hope for." Grant turned her in his arms so she was facing him, and he cupped her face in his hands. "I am the one who should be grateful," he said. "I sent for a mail-order bride because I thought I needed help with the ranch. What I received was a partner and a wife and the love of my life." "You have given me more than I ever deserved, Dorothy. We have given each other a life worth living," Dorothy said. "That is all I ever wanted." They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, and inside the house, their children played happily, safe and loved. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and earth, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the emerging stars. The years continued to pass in that gentle rhythm of ranch life, marked by the seasons and the growth of their children. James grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. He learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, and he followed Grant everywhere, imitating his father's steady movements and quiet competence. Margaret was different, more introspective and gentle, drawn to the animals and the garden. She spent hours with Dorothy, learning about plants and how to care for the sheep, and she had a gift for gentling even the most skittish creatures. In 1883, when Dorothy was 30 and Grant was 39, they welcomed their third child, another son they named Thomas. He was a happy, easy baby who rarely fussed, and he seemed content simply to observe the bustling household around him. With 3 children, the ranch was constantly filled with noise and activity, and Dorothy sometimes marveled at how full her life had become. Grant's ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in the region. His cattle were known for their quality, and Dorothy's sheep had won prizes at the county fair for 3 years running. They had built a new barn and expanded their grazing land, and they employed 4 full-time hands to help with the work. Despite their success, Grant and Dorothy remained humble and generous, often helping neighbors who were struggling and contributing to community projects in Salina. The town itself had transformed dramatically. The railroad had come through in 1881, bringing new commerce and new people. Salina boasted 2 hotels now, 3 churches, a proper school with 2 teachers, and a main street lined with thriving businesses. Grant served on the town council, and Dorothy helped establish a library in the old land office building, donating many of her own books to start the collection. One summer afternoon, when the prairie heat shimmered in waves and the children were napping, Dorothy found a letter waiting for her at the general store. It was from Philadelphia, from one of the women she had worked with at the mill, and the contents made her go pale. The mill had burned down 3 months earlier, killing 14 workers who had been trapped inside when the doors jammed. The letter writer asked if there might be work available in Kansas, as she could not bear to stay in Philadelphia any longer. Dorothy showed the letter to Grant that evening, and they discussed it long into the night. The next day, Grant sent a telegram offering the woman a position helping Dorothy with the household and the children, and promising to pay her fare west. 2 weeks later, Sarah Moore arrived in Salina, thin and haunted and grateful beyond words. She settled into the ranch, and Dorothy's kindness and the wholesome work slowly helped heal the trauma she had endured. It became something of a pattern. Dorothy maintained correspondence with several of her former co-workers, and over the years, 3 more women made their way to Kansas, finding work and eventually husbands among the homesteaders and cowboys of the region. Dorothy took great satisfaction in helping these women build new lives, knowing how easily she herself could have been trapped in that burning mill. As the children grew older, Dorothy began teaching them at home, supplementing the education they received at the Salina school. She taught them not just reading and arithmetic, but also about compassion and fairness and the importance of treating all people with dignity. Grant taught them about the land and the animals, about responsibility and hard work, and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. James, at 10 years old, was already a skilled rider and roper, and he had his father's gift with animals. He was confident and outgoing, popular with the other children in town, and he spoke often of one day running the ranch himself. Margaret, at 8, was quieter but no less determined. She had started raising her own small flock of chickens, selling the eggs in town and carefully saving every penny she earned. Thomas, at 4, was still young but showed signs of having his mother's analytical mind, always asking questions about how things worked and why. In the spring of 1887, tragedy struck when Grant's former ranch hand, Tom Wyatt, died suddenly of a heart ailment. Tom had no family, and Grant took it upon himself to arrange a proper funeral and to purchase a stone marker for his grave. The loss affected Grant deeply, reminding him of his own mortality and the importance of cherishing every moment with his family. That summer, Grant made a decision that surprised Dorothy. He began writing down the story of their life together, recording the details of how they met and fell in love, documenting the growth of the ranch and the birth of their children. He worked on it in the evenings, his handwriting careful and deliberate, and when Dorothy asked why he was doing it, he smiled. "I want our grandchildren to know our story," he said. "I want them to understand that love can come from the most unexpected places, and that a good marriage is built on respect and partnership as much as passion. I want them to know that your grandmother took a tremendous risk when she came to Kansas to marry a stranger, and that risk brought both of us more happiness than we ever imagined possible." Dorothy was deeply moved by this, and she began adding her own memories and perspectives to Grant's written account. Together, they created a record of their life that would become a treasured family document for generations. In 1889, when James was 14, a crisis arose that tested the family in new ways. A harsh winter had been followed by a dry spring, and by summer, drought gripped the region. Water became precious, and Grant made the difficult decision to sell off a portion of the cattle herd rather than risk losing them all to dehydration and starvation. It was a financially painful choice, but it proved to be the right one, as many ranchers who tried to wait out the drought lost everything. Dorothy's garden suffered despite her best efforts, and for the first time in years, they did not have surplus vegetables to preserve for winter. The sheep did better than the cattle, as they needed less water and could survive on the drought-stressed grass, and it was the income from Dorothy's wool sales that kept them afloat during those difficult months. The drought broke in the fall with rains that turned the prairie green again, and Grant slowly began rebuilding his herd. The experience had been humbling, reminding them both that even with years of success behind them, they were still at the mercy of nature and circumstance. But it also reinforced their faith in each other and in their ability to weather any storm together. As the 1890s dawned, the Mallory Ranch stood as a testament to perseverance and love. Grant was now 50 years old, his hair graying at the temples but his body still strong from years of ranch work. Dorothy was 37, her face lined by sun and wind but her eyes still bright with the contentment she had found in Kansas. Their children were growing into remarkable young people, each with their own dreams and ambitions. James, at 15, had grown tall and broad-shouldered, looking more like his father every day. He worked alongside Grant as a full partner now, trusted with major decisions and responsibilities. He had inherited his father's quiet competence and his mother's compassion, and he was courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sensible girl named Elizabeth who shared his love of ranch life. Margaret, at 13, had blossomed into a thoughtful, artistic young woman who spent her free time sketching the prairie landscape and the animals. She talked of perhaps becoming a teacher, of using her education to help other young women who had not been as fortunate as she was. Dorothy encouraged this dream, seeing in her daughter a chance to make a difference in the wider world. Thomas, at 9, was proving to be the scholar of the family. He devoured every book he could get his hands on, and his teachers in Salina said he had a brilliant mind that should be cultivated. Grant and Dorothy discussed sending him to college when he was old enough, wanting to give him opportunities they had never had themselves. In 1892, Dorothy gave birth to their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Rose. She arrived unexpectedly, as Dorothy had thought she was past the age of bearing children, but she was a welcome blessing nonetheless. Rose was a delightful baby, sunny and affectionate, and she brought renewed joy to the household. The older children doted on her, and Grant joked that they would never need to hire help again with so many eager hands ready to care for the baby. One evening, as Dorothy sat on the porch rocking baby Rose while the older children played in the yard, Grant joined her with 2 cups of tea. He settled into the chair beside her and reached over to gently touch the baby's soft hair. "You remember the day you arrived in Salina?" he asked quietly. "How could I forget?" Dorothy said with a smile. "I was terrified and exhausted, and I was certain I had made a terrible mistake coming to Kansas to marry a stranger." "I was just as terrified," Grant admitted. "I kept thinking that you would take one look at me and the rough town and the modest ranch and decide to go straight back to Philadelphia. When you agreed to stay, even before we really knew each other, I could hardly believe my good fortune." "You gave me a choice," Dorothy said. "You offered me a room at the boarding house and time to decide, and you promised that if I was unhappy, you would pay for my return passage. No one had ever given me a choice before. That meant more to me than you could possibly know." "I wanted you to choose to stay," Grant said. "I wanted you to want to be here, not feel trapped. And you did choose to stay, Dorothy, and you have given me the most incredible life. When I placed that advertisement in the Philadelphia newspaper, I was hoping for a practical partner to help run the ranch. Instead, I found the love of my life, a woman who is my equal in every way, who has made me better than I ever thought I could be." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes, as she still did whenever Grant spoke so openly about his feelings. Even after 14 years of marriage, his tenderness could move her deeply. "You showed me that life could be more than just survival," she said. "You showed me tenderness and respect and love. You made me believe that I was worth something beyond what my hands could produce. Every day with you has been a gift, Grant. Every single day." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the prairie they both loved, while their children played and baby Rose slept peacefully in her mother's arms. The wind carried the scent of grass and wildflowers, and in the distance, the cattle lowed softly as they settled for the night. Over the next few years, the family continued to grow and change. James married Elizabeth in the spring of 1895, and they built a small house on the far side of the ranch property, with plans for James to gradually take over more of the ranch operations as Grant grew older. Their first child, a son, was born in 1896, making Grant and Dorothy grandparents for the first time. Grant held his grandson with the same tender amazement he had shown with his own children, and Dorothy marveled at the continuity of it all, at how their love had created this expanding circle of family. Margaret, true to her word, went to teaching college in Topeka in 1897, the first member of either family to pursue higher education. It was difficult for Dorothy to let her go, but she was immensely proud of her daughter's ambition and intelligence. Margaret came home for holidays and summers, full of stories about her studies and her plans to make a difference in the world. Thomas proved to be every bit as brilliant as his teachers had predicted, and he won a scholarship to the University of Kansas when he was just 16 years old. He wanted to study engineering, to build bridges and railroads and help connect the growing nation. Grant and Dorothy supported his dreams, even though it meant their son would likely not return to ranch life. Rose grew into a spirited, joyful child who loved both the ranch and the town equally. She made friends easily and brought constant laughter into the household. At 6 years old, she was already showing signs of having her mother's practical nature combined with her father's easy charm. In the summer of 1899, Salina celebrated its 40th anniversary as an incorporated town. The whole community came together for a week of festivities, including horse races, a barbecue, and a dance. Grant and Dorothy attended with their children and grandchildren, and they were honored as one of the founding families who had helped build the town into the thriving community it had become. At the dance, Grant led Dorothy onto the floor for a waltz, and as they moved together to the music, Dorothy reflected on how far they had come. The frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 21 years earlier felt like a different person, though Dorothy knew she was simply the fulfilled version of who that woman had always had the potential to be. "You ever regret it?" Dorothy asked as they danced. "Do you ever wish you had married someone you could court properly, someone from Salina who knew this life from the beginning?" Grant pulled her closer, and his gray-blue eyes were warm as they looked into hers. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for one single moment. You are the only woman I have ever loved, Dorothy, and you will be the only woman I ever will love. Bringing you to Kansas was the best decision I ever made." "It was the best decision I ever made, too," Dorothy said, resting her head against his shoulder. "Coming here, marrying you, building this life together. I came expecting hardship, and you showed me tenderness I never knew existed. You showed me what love truly means." They danced until the music ended, and then they stood together watching their children and grandchildren and the community they were part of, feeling blessed beyond measure. As the new century dawned in 1900, Grant and Dorothy took stock of their life together. The ranch was prosperous and well-established, managed now primarily by James with his father's guidance. They had 4 healthy children, all pursuing their own paths and dreams, and 2 grandchildren with another on the way. They had a home filled with love and memories, and they were respected members of a thriving community. But more than any of these external successes, they had each other. After more than 20 years of marriage, their love had only deepened and strengthened. They still made each other laugh, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still reached for each other in the night. Grant still brought Dorothy wildflowers for no reason, except that he knew she loved them, and Dorothy still mended his clothes with special care, adding small embroidered details that made him smile. One warm evening in late May of 1900, they rode out together to a spot on the ranch that had always been special to them, a rise that overlooked the creek and offered a view of the prairie stretching endlessly toward the horizon. They spread a blanket and sat watching the sunset, Grant's arm around Dorothy's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "I have been thinking about Tom Wyatt lately," Grant said quietly. "About how he died without anyone to mourn him except those of us who worked with him. He was a good man, but he died alone." "You are thinking about your own mortality," Dorothy said, not as a question but as a statement. "I am 59 years old," Grant said. "I have lived a good life, a better life than I ever expected. But I cannot help wondering how much time we have left together." Dorothy lifted her head to look at him, and she saw genuine worry in his expression. She reached up to cup his weathered face in her hand. "However much time we have, it will not be enough," she said honestly. "But we will not waste a moment of it on fear. We will continue to live fully and love deeply, and when our time comes, we will face it together, just as we have faced everything else." "I love you," Grant said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond, if such things are possible." "I love you too," Dorothy said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grant Mallory. Meeting you, marrying you, building this life with you, it has been the greatest adventure of my life." They kissed as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the prairie wind whispered around them like a blessing. In that moment, they were not a middle-aged rancher and his mail-order bride, not parents and grandparents with responsibilities and worries. They were simply Grant and Dorothy, Two people who had found each other against all odds and had created something beautiful and lasting from their unlikely beginning. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm they had established. In 1903, Margaret returned to Salina after completing her education and took a position as the head teacher at the expanded schoolhouse. She married a doctor who had recently opened a practice in town, and she continued to teach even after starting her own family. Her first child, a daughter, was born in 1905. Thomas graduated from the university in 1904 with highest honors and accepted a position with a railroad company, working on the expansion of lines through the Western Territories. He visited home rarely but wrote long letters describing his adventures and his work, and Grant and Dorothy were proud of his accomplishments even as they missed him. Rose grew into a capable young woman who loved the ranch as much as her oldest brother did. She helped Dorothy with everything from the garden to managing the household finances, and she had inherited her mother's gift for making everything run smoothly. In 1908, at 18 years old, she began courting a young cowboy who worked on a neighboring ranch, a respectful young man named Daniel, who reminded Grant very much of himself at that age. James and Elizabeth had 5 children by 1910, filling the ranch with the sounds of young voices and laughter. The ranch continued to prosper under James's management, and Grant gradually transitioned into a more advisory role, content to let his son run the day-to-day operations while he spent more time with Dorothy and their growing family. In the spring of 1912, Grant and Dorothy celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary. They marked the occasion with a family gathering that brought together all their children and grandchildren, a noisy, joyful event that filled their home to bursting. As Dorothy looked around at the faces of the family she and Grant had created together, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude and love. Grant was 71 years old now, still strong but moving more slowly than he once had. Dorothy was 59, her hair more gray than brown, her hands marked by years of work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had stood nervously together in the Salina church, pledging their lives to each other despite being virtual strangers. That night, after all the guests had gone home and the house was finally quiet, Grant and Dorothy sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The May evening was warm and mild, and the prairie stretched away into darkness punctuated by stars. "Do you remember what you told me the day I proposed?" Grant asked, his voice soft in the quiet night. Dorothy smiled, remembering. "I told you I was happy here, happier than I had ever been. I told you I would be honored to marry you. And I promised that I would do everything in my power to make sure you never regretted that decision," Grant said. "Did I keep that promise, Dorothy? Have you been happy?" Dorothy turned to him, and even in the dim light, she could see the vulnerability in his expression, the genuine need to know that he had given her a good life. She took both his hands in hers and held them tightly. "Grant Mallory, you have given me more happiness than I ever dreamed possible," she said, her voice firm and clear. "When I came to Kansas on that stagecoach, I was running from desperation and poverty, expecting nothing more than hard work and basic survival. You showed me tenderness and respect and love. You made me your true partner, valuing my opinions and contributions. You gave me children and grandchildren, a home and a purpose, and most importantly, you gave me yourself. Every day of our marriage has been a gift. You kept your promise 1,000 times over." Tears shone in Grant's eyes, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her with the same gentle strength he had always shown. They stayed like that for a long time, two people who had built a life together from almost nothing, who had turned a practical arrangement into a great love story. "I was so lonely before you came," Grant said quietly. "I did not even realize how lonely I was. This ranch, this land, it was all just work, just something to occupy my time. You made it a home. You made it a life worth living. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you for taking a chance on a stranger, for choosing to stay, for loving me. Thank you for showing me what love could be," Dorothy whispered. "Thank you for being the man you are, kind and good and true. I would make the same choice again in an instant, Grant. Every time I would choose you." They sat together under the stars, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the distant call of an owl, the rustling of grass in the wind, the soft lowing of cattle settling for the night. It was the same landscape that had greeted Dorothy when she first arrived in Kansas 34 years earlier, but it was completely transformed by the life they had built upon it. In the years that followed, Grant and Dorothy continued to be the heart of their family. They watched their grandchildren grow and their children thrive, and they took deep satisfaction in seeing the values they had worked so hard to instill being passed down to the next generation. The ranch remained successful, a testament to the solid foundation they had built together. Rose married her cowboy Daniel in 1913, and they settled on a homestead not far from the main ranch, close enough for frequent visits, but far enough for independence. Dorothy helped Rose set up her new home, sharing the wisdom she had gained over decades of ranch life, and Grant worked with Daniel to get his cattle operation started. In 1915, when Grant was 74 and Dorothy was 62, they made the decision to officially hand over full control of the ranch to James, though they continued to live in the house they had built together all those years ago. It was time, they agreed, for the younger generation to take the reins fully, though they remained available for advice and support. They settled into a quieter rhythm, spending their days tending Dorothy's beloved garden, visiting with their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. They took long walks across the prairie, Grant's hand steady on Dorothy's arm, and they talked about everything and nothing, the way couples who have spent decades together can do. One afternoon in the summer of 1917, as they sat on their porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the prairie, Dorothy asked Grant if he had any regrets about his life. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the lightning flash in the distance, and then he shook his head. "No regrets," he said firmly. "I have been blessed beyond measure. I have had love and family and purpose. I have worked hard and built something lasting, and I have had you, Dorothy, every day for 39 years. How could I possibly have any regrets?" "I feel the same way," Dorothy said, reaching for his hand. "My life did not begin until I came to Kansas and met you. Everything before that was just preparation, I think, so that I would appreciate what we built together. You saved me, Grant, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Grant said, squeezing her hand gently. "We made each other whole." As the storm passed and the sun broke through the clouds, painting a rainbow across the prairie sky, Dorothy and Grant sat together in the home they had built, surrounded by the evidence of their love, the ranch that thrived under their son's care, the garden that still flourished under Dorothy's attention, the photographs of children and grandchildren that lined the walls, the written record of their life together that Grant had carefully maintained. They had come together as strangers, brought together by necessity and circumstance, with no expectations beyond practical partnership. But what they had found was so much more: a love that had weathered every storm, a partnership that had built a legacy, a tenderness that had transformed two lonely people into one unbreakable unit. Dorothy Evans had come to Kansas expecting hardship, expecting to merely survive in a harsh land with a stranger for a husband. Instead, Grant Mallory had shown her tenderness, she never knew existed, had loved her with a constancy and depth that still amazed her even after nearly 4 decades. And together, they had created a life that neither could have imagined alone, a life filled with love and family and purpose, a life that would echo through generations to come. As the sun set on that summer evening in 1917, Grant and Dorothy sat together on their porch, hands clasped, hearts still beating in the same rhythm they had found all those years ago. They had built something beautiful from nothing, had turned a mail-order arrangement into a great love story, had proven that tenderness and respect could create a foundation stronger than stone. And when they finally went inside as darkness fell, they walked hand in hand, still partners, still lovers, still the two people who had found each other in the unlikeliest of ways and had chosen, every single day, to continue choosing each other. Their story was complete, their ending as happy as any could hope for, a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone.